Santa. GeeZer saving Christmas, one grumble at a time. Act 1. The Reluctant Santa. Chapter 1:1. The geezer next door, the day Gerald Grimsby decided Christmas was a conspiracy to ruin his life, began like any other. The sound of off-key caroling drifted through his cracked window, carried by a band of over-eager neighborhood children who'd been singing the same verse of Deck the Halls for 20 minutes. Gerald, still in his plaid pajamas, glared at his frosted front yard from the safety of his recliner. His lawn, once a proud display of uniform grass blades, now lay buried under what he called nature's dandruff. Gerald was known for feeding the occasional stray cat and begrudgingly helping a neighbor. The kids had planted themselves in front of the Thompson house, where inflatable snowmen and blinking lights battled for dominance like a seasonal arms race. Gerald scoffed. The Thompsons had added a 20-foot animatronic reindeer this year. The thing's head turned robotically, like it was scanning the horizon for an excuse to malfunction. Unbelievable, Gerald muttered, taking a sip of his lukewarm tea. It's not even December yet, or is it? His cat, Chairman Meow Yow, stretched lazily from its perch on the windowsill. It had the decency to ignore him, something Gerald appreciated in a pet. The carolers finished their song and scampered toward his yard, their eyes gleaming with the sort of optimism Gerald hadn't seen since the late 70s. They paused at his gate, staring up at the faded "No Trespassing" sign, then whispered among themselves. One brave soul, a red-haired boy in a scarf that was entirely too long for his stubby legs, pushed open the gate. "Oh, no, you don't," Gerald growled, rising from his chair. His knees cracked like ancient door hinges, but his glare was as sharp as ever. He flung open the door, wielding his tea mug like a weapon. "You kids step 1 foot on my lawn and I swear I'll call someone." The kids froze, their tiny breaths visible in the winter air. Gerald noticed one of them clutching a tin of cookies. Was this a bribe? Were they organized? He narrowed his eyes. Merry Christmas, Mr. Grimsby," the red-haired boy stammered, holding out the tin. The other kids nudged him forward like he was walking the plank. Gerald eyed the tin suspiciously. It was covered in cheerful snowflake patterns and had "Joy" written in obnoxiously large letters across the lid. He didn't trust it. "Cookies?" Gerald said. "What's the catch? You want me to donate to something? Or worse, sing along?" "No, sir," the boy said. "We just thought maybe you could use some holiday cheer." Gerald snorted. "Holiday cheer? What I could use is a peaceful afternoon without kids yelling in my yard. Now, scram before I start charging rent." The kids retreated, murmuring about mean old Mr. Grimsby as they disappeared down the street. Gerald stood in the doorway, victorious, as if he'd just repelled an invasion. "Holiday cheer," he muttered, slamming the door. "What am I? Some Hallmark special?" By the time evening rolled around, Gerald was ready to settle in with his TV and a microwave dinner. He flipped through the channels, searching for anything that didn't involve jingling bells or fat men in red suits. He settled on a nature documentary about penguins, which felt appropriately cold and distant. Just as the narrator began explaining the complexities of penguin courtship, a loud crash shook the house. Gerald jumped, nearly spilling his tea. Chairman Meow hissed and bolted under the couch. "What now?" Gerald grumbled, shuffling to the window. He pulled back the curtain and squinted into the snowy night. There, in the middle of his lawn, sat a sleigh. Not just any sleigh, mind you, but a sleigh that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Christmas card. It was red, oversized, and obnoxiously festive, with gold trim that glinted under the streetlights. A team of reindeer, real breathing reindeer, stood awkwardly in front of it, their antlers adorned with jingling bells. Gerald blinked. He wasn't drunk. He hadn't had a drink in decades. So either the penguins on TV had really taken a turn, or there was a sleigh on his lawn. Unbelievable, he muttered. First the kids, now this. He stormed outside, forgetting his slippers in his irritation. The cold snow bit at his feet. But he was too focused on the ridiculousness in front of him to care. Hey! He shouted at the sleigh. Whoever you are, you've got about 10 seconds to explain why you're parked on my property before I call the cops. A groan came from inside the sleigh. Gerald approached cautiously, half expecting to find a bunch of pranksters hiding in the back. Instead, he found a man in a red suit, slumped over the reins, his white beard covered in snow. Great, Gerald said. Santa's drunk. The man groaned again and rolled onto his back, revealing a face that looked remarkably like every mall Santa Gerald had ever seen. His eyes fluttered open, and he stared at Gerald in confusion. Who are you? The man asked weakly. I'll dress on this song. I'm the guy whose lawn you're wrecking, Gerald snapped. Who are you supposed to be? The man sat up with a wince, brushing snow off his suit. I'm Santa Claus. Gerald stared at him, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he folded his arms. Santa Claus, huh? Let me guess, you had one too many eggnogs and now you're moonlighting as a reindeer herder? I'm serious, Santa said, rubbing his temple. I slipped on some ice during a landing. Lost control of the sleigh. Where am I? You're on my lawn, Gerald said. Now get this contraption out of here before the HOA starts sending me letters. Santa groaned and tried to stand, but his legs wobbled like a newborn foal. Gerald sighed. He didn't have time for this. Fine, he muttered. Let's get you inside before you freeze to death. But you're explaining this nonsense in detail. And if I find out you're some drunk cosplayer, I'm calling the authorities. Back inside, Gerald plopped Santa onto the couch and handed him a blanket. Chairman Meow emerged from his hiding spot, sniffed the stranger, and promptly sneezed. So, Gerald said, standing over Santa like a grumpy interrogator. What's the deal? You lose a bet? Santa looked at him with weary eyes. I told you, I'm Santa Claus. And I'm the Tooth Fairy, Gerald deadpanned. Start talking, buddy. Before Santa could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. Gerald frowned. He opened it to find a woman in a fur-lined coat, her silver hair tucked under a red hat. She didn't wait for an invitation. Where is he? She demanded, stepping inside. I swear, if you've hurt yourself again. Oh, for heaven's sake. She spotted Santa on the couch and sighed. One job, Nicholas. One job. And you are? Gerald asked, his patience wearing thin. Mrs. Claus, she said, as if it were obvious. Gerald blinked. Then he turned to the camera that wasn't there, like a man realizing he was the butt of a cosmic joke. This, he muttered, is officially the worst day of my life. End of that chapter 1. Chapter 2. Santa's Slip-Up. Gerald stood at his front door, staring at the ridiculous scene unfolding on his lawn. The sleigh. An actual glittering sleigh that looked like it belonged in a department store window, sat crooked in the snow, its runners dug deep into his once pristine yard. 8 reindeer, looking as bewildered as Gerald felt, huffed plumes of steam into the frosty air. One of them sneezed, sending a spray of snow in all directions. Of course, Gerald muttered, rubbing his temples. Because what else could possibly go wrong today? Then came the groaning. The man in the sleigh, red suit, white beard, the whole 9 yards, sat slumped against the backrest. looking like he'd just survived a bar fight with Frosty the Snowman. Gerald squinted. The man was holding his head, muttering something about bad visibility and slippery rooftops. "Hey, you!" Gerald shouted, stepping onto his porch, the icy air hitting his face like a slap. "What the hell are you doing in my yard? And who gave you permission to ruin my lawn with this?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he tried to sit up, only to slip and tumble face first into the sleigh's plush red cushions. One of the reindeer turned to Gerald, its antlers jingling obnoxiously, and snorted as if to say, "You try managing this guy." "Unbelievable," Gerald muttered, trudging down the steps. He regretted it immediately when his slippers sank into the snow, soaking his socks. Great, just great. By the time Gerald reached the sleigh, the man had managed to right himself, though he was swaying like a Christmas tree in a hurricane. Up close, he looked even more absurd. Rosy cheeks, gold-rimmed glasses perched precariously on his nose, and that unmistakable red and white suit. "All right," Gerald said, hands on his hips. "Who are you supposed to be? A mall Santa who got lost? Some prankster who thinks this is funny? Because let me tell you, buddy, I'm not laughing." The man blinked at him, his eyes dazed. I'm Santa Claus." Gerald stared. Then he laughed. It wasn't a hearty laugh, more of a dry, humorless chuckle that felt like sandpaper. "Santa Claus? Oh, that's rich. And I suppose those reindeer can fly too?" They can actually," Santa said, wincing as he rubbed his temple. "But, we had a little mishap. The rooftop was icy and we sort of crash-landed here." Gerald raised an eyebrow and turned to the reindeer, who were now huddled together, looking equal parts sheepish and irritated. One of them, Gerald wasn't sure which, since they all looked the same to him, let out a disgruntled grunt. "You expect me to believe this nonsense?" Gerald asked, crossing his arms. "You're Santa Claus, the Santa Claus, and you just happened to crash land in my yard? What, you couldn't aim for the Thompsons' place? They love this holiday junk." Santa sighed. "I don't have time to explain. Christmas Eve is a tight schedule, and I need to get back in the air." Gerald snorted. "But buddy, you're not going anywhere until you explain why you're using my lawn as a parking lot. Do you have insurance for this thing? Or are magical sleighs exempt?" Santa tried to stand, wobbling like a newborn reindeer. Gerald, despite his better judgment, grabbed the man's arm to steady him. The suit felt ridiculously plush, like it had been stolen from a luxury bathrobe collection. "Look," Santa said, his voice strained. "I understand this is unconventional, but I am Santa Claus, and I need to get back to delivering presents." "Yeah, sure," Gerald said, guiding him to the porch. "And I'm the Easter Bunny. Sit down before you fall over again." By the time they reached the porch, Santa was wheezing, and Gerald was seriously questioning his life choices. He plopped the man onto the bench and handed him a blanket he'd grabbed on the way out. "Thanks," Santa muttered, wrapping it around his shoulders. Gerald leaned against the railing, glaring at the sleigh. The reindeer were now munching on what appeared to be his wife's long-abandoned vegetable garden. "Great," he muttered. "Now they're eating my carrots. Just fantastic." Santa followed his gaze and winced. "I'll, reimburse you for that." "Oh, don't bother," Gerald said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'll just add it to the growing list of ways this holiday is ruining my life." Santa sighed. "You don't like Christmas, do you?" Gerald barked out a laugh. "Oh, what gave it away? The lack of decorations? Or the fact that I haven't had a single peaceful moment since the craziness started?" Santa shook his head. That's unfortunate. Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy. Yeah, well, joy is overrated, Gerald said, crossing his arms. Now, are you going to tell me the truth or do I have to call the cops? I already told you, Santa said, looking genuinely exasperated. I'm Santa Claus, the real one. Right, Gerald said, his tone flat. And I'm supposed to believe that because... Santa leaned forward, his eyes twinkling, despite his apparent exhaustion. Because if you don't, you're going to have a very long night? An hour later, Gerald found himself pacing his living room while Santa sat on the couch, sipping tea like he owned the place. Chairman Meow watched from the coffee table, his tail flicking in irritation. So let me get this straight, Gerald said, gesturing wildly. You're Santa Claus. You deliver presents to millions of kids every year. And you just happened to crash on my lawn because of some ice? Santa nodded, his beard bobbing with the motion. That about sums it up. And you expect me to believe that? Whether you believe it or not doesn't change the facts, Santa said, taking another sip of tea. Gerald pinched the bridge of his nose. Unbelievable. This is unbelievable. There was a knock at the door. Gerald frowned. Who else could possibly... Before he could finish, the door burst open, revealing a woman in a fur-lined coat and a no-nonsense expression. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, and she carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. Mrs. Claus, Santa said, smiling weakly. You're here. Yes, I'm here, she said, storming inside. And I'm not happy. Do you know how many calls I've gotten from the elves about your little... detour? Wait a minute, Gerald said, holding up a hand. You're Mrs. Claus? Yes, she said, looking him up and down. And you must be the unfortunate soul stuck with this mess. That's putting it lightly, Gerald muttered. Mrs. Claus turned to Santa. Nicholas, you've got a lot of explaining to do. And you, she pointed at Gerald, we might need your help. Help? Gerald said, laughing bitterly. Lady, I'm a retired bus driver, not a Christmas miracle worker. Well, tonight, Mrs. Claus said, her tone firm. You're going to have to be both. Gerald groaned. This is officially the worst day of my life. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Mrs. Claus knocks. The knock at the door was sharp and insistent, a sound that immediately grated on Gerald's nerves. He'd barely had time to process the fact that Santa Claus himself was sipping tea on his couch. Tea, might he add, that he had made. And now someone else had decided to interrupt his evening. Don't answer it, Gerald muttered, glaring at Santa, who had the audacity to look relaxed. If it's another singing child or someone trying to sell me holiday candles, I swear. The knock came again, harder this time. Coming! Gerald shouted, stomping toward the door. You'd think people would take a hint. He swung the door open, fully prepared to give whoever it was a piece of his mind. But the words froze in his throat. Standing on his porch was a woman with the kind of commanding presence that made Gerald feel like he'd accidentally wandered into a courtroom. Her silver hair was swept up into an elegant bun, and she wore a red and white coat trimmed with fur that practically screamed important. In her hands was a clipboard of all things, and behind her stood a diminutive figure with pointy ears and a sour expression. Gerald Grimsby? The woman asked, her tone clipped and businesslike. Gerald blinked, thrown off by the fact that she already knew his name. Who's asking? The woman stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her boots leaving snowy footprints on his rug. She glanced around, her sharp eyes landing on Santa, who was still lounging on the couch like he didn't have a care in the world. "For the love of Christmas, Nicholas," she said, her voice rising. "What happened this time?" "Nice to see you too, dear," Santa mumbled, not meeting her gaze. "Dear?" Gerald repeated, closing the door behind her. "Wait a minute, you're not telling me this is Mrs. Claus," the woman said crisply, offering him a tight smile. "And you must be the poor man whose evening we've thoroughly disrupted." "Oh no," Gerald said, waving his hands. No, this is already way too much. First, Santa crashes into my yard and now you're telling me Mrs. Claus is real too. What is this, some kind of elaborate prank? Where are the cameras?" The small figure behind her finally spoke up, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, because we totally have time to stage a prank this big. The North Pole's just bursting with free time." Gerald frowned, looking down at the tiny woman. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Trixie," she said, crossing her arms. "Head of elf operations. You're welcome." As Gerald gawked at Mrs. Claus's clipboard, the small figure in an oversized parka pushed past him, holding up a glowing tablet. "Your sleigh's magic engine is running at 12% efficiency," Trixie said, her tone sharp. "Honestly, Santa, how have you not crashed sooner? Amateur hour." "Elves," Gerald muttered, rubbing his temples. "Of course, why not?" Mrs. Claus turned to Trixie with a raised brow. "You're not helping." "Wasn't trying to," Trixie shot back. "Can someone please tell me what's going on here?" Gerald snapped. "Why is my house suddenly the epicenter of Christmas chaos?" Mrs. Claus sighed, adjusting her grip on the clipboard. "It's simple, Mr. Grimsby. Nicholas, Santa, as you know him, is injured. His sleigh crashed, Christmas is in jeopardy. And according to Clause 47B of the Magical Holiday Charter, in the event that Santa is unable to perform his duties, the nearest qualified adult must step in." Gerald blinked. "The nearest qualified adult? What does that even mean?" "It means you," Mrs. Claus said, her tone making it clear she wasn't in the mood for arguments. "Congratulations, Mr. Grimsby. Tonight you're Santa." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint hum of the furnace. Gerald stared at Mrs. Claus, waiting for her to laugh, to reveal that this was all some elaborate joke. But she didn't. She just stood there, clipboard in hand, looking entirely too serious. "You're joking," Gerald finally said. "This is a joke, right?" "I assure you it's not," Mrs. Claus replied. "Now, if you'll just sign here." She held out the clipboard, pointing to a line at the bottom of what looked like a very official contract. Gerald took a step back, holding up his hands. "Oh no, absolutely not. I'm not signing anything. I'm a retired bus driver, not a magical delivery man. Find someone else." "There is no one else," Mrs. Claus said firmly. "The sleigh is enchanted to only respond to the chosen Santa. That's you, Mr. Grimsby." "Why me?" Gerald asked, his voice rising. "Why not one of those carolers who keep bothering me? Or the Thompsons down the street? They love this kind of stuff." Trixie rolled her eyes. "Because you were closest. That's literally how the magic works." "Well, it's terrible magic," Gerald said. "And I'm not doing it. End of discussion." Mrs. Claus stepped closer, fixing him with a steely gaze that could have melted the polar ice caps. "Listen to me, Gerald. If you don't step up, millions of children will wake up tomorrow with no presents under the tree. Do you really want to be responsible for that?" Gerald hesitated. He didn't particularly care about Christmas, but even he wasn't heartless enough to ruin it for a bunch of kids. Still, the thought of flying around in a sleigh, dealing with reindeer and chimneys and who knows what else, made him want to crawl back into bed and pretend this night had never happened. Santa, who had been quiet up until now, cleared his throat. Gerald, I know this seems overwhelming, but Christmas needs you. I need you. Gerald turned to him, scowling. You don't even know me. Santa smiled faintly. I know enough. You're stubborn, sure, but you're also dependable. And deep down, you care more than you let on. Gerald opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself staring at the reindeer through the window, who had begun pawing impatiently at the snow. One of them, he noticed, was chewing on a string of Christmas lights it had apparently yanked off his house. Unbelievable, Gerald muttered. He turned back to Mrs. Claus. Fine, I'll do it, but only because I don't want those things eating my siding. Wonderful, Mrs. Claus said, her smile returning. Now let's get you suited up. 30 minutes later, Gerald stood in his living room, wearing the full Santa ensemble. The coat was too tight in the shoulders, the boots pinched his toes, and the hat itched like it was made of fiberglass. I look ridiculous, he grumbled, glaring at his reflection in the window. You look adequate, Trixie said, smirking, which is a big improvement, considering where we started. Mrs. Claus handed him a scroll with a flourish. Here's the list. Trixie will help you navigate the sleigh. Great, Gerald said dryly. A bossy elf and a flying death trap. Just what I always wanted. You'll do fine, Mrs. Claus said, patting his arm. Just remember, it's about the kids. Gerald sighed, glancing at the sleigh through the window. He couldn't believe what he was about to do. If I die, he said, I'm haunting all of you. Trixie grinned. Better get used to it, GeeZer Claus. This is just the beginning. And with that, they stepped outside, into the cold night, and onto the start of Gerald's very unexpected Christmas adventure. End of chapter 3.